In this video, we're going to look at the most recent report which has come out of sports psychology, which is evaluating one of its key questions, and at least the one to me which I think is the most important, or the one I'm most interested in, which is the relationship between psychological interventions and actual improvements in athletic performance. This will provide sort of a nice snapshot of the current state of the field and where we stand on these questions. The study was titled The Effects of Psychological Interventions to Enhance Athletic Performance, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, which came out in the Journal of Sports Medicine in 2024. So, of course, the effects of psychological interventions to enhance athletic performance. This is asking, when we target something psychological, what are the effects of that on actual real-world athletic performance? Now, you think this would be something that the field has a pretty sound answer of. It's sort of the main thing in sports psychology, but it really doesn't. So when we read through the introduction here, the authors are talking about sort of how the field's been around for 40 years, various trials have been done, but then we get here and it says, although evaluation methods had varied over the years, focusing on various sport-related outcomes, populations, and interventions, some vital research set questions are still unanswered. Specifically, one such question is whether psychological interventions techniques impact actual sport performance outcomes in clearly defined athlete samples. And then if they do, what are these interventions? Now, that's a pretty key question. Essentially, do psychological interventions work to enhance performance in actual athletes? And then if they do, what are those interventions? Now, you might wonder, because when you read the Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology textbook, or just hear most people talking about it, it's always presented as if there's sort of this sound scientific base behind it. Those of us who read more into literature know that this is basically the pattern, and it is this. The weaker the study designs, the better the results we see, and as sports psychology interventions become more well designed, the experiments are better conducted, these results drop off. So in 2022, there's this infamous doctoral thesis written by Zella Moore, which examined the field, and it basically showed that, for one, most of the interventions in sports psychology would be considered extremely low standard by the requirements of professional psychology. And second, when you take the studies which are well designed, none of them really produce performance benefits in athletes. So that was sort of the state of things in 2002. And the reason these studies were often not well designed was for many reasons, but the three main ones were they rarely used a randomized control trial, which is sort of the standard. And then often the population they used was not competitive athletes. And most of them relied just on university students who aren't competitive athletes. And another one was the actual measures of performance, sometimes kind of dubious. For example, it doesn't directly measure performance, but they'll measure something like changes in attention and then assume those changes of attention relate to real-world performance in athletes, but we don't really know this. So again, this study is the most recent attempt to combine all the literature which is asking this question about the relationship between psychological interventions and performance. So what I'd like to do here is first objectively just go through what the study says, try to present exactly the way the information comes into it and then goes out of it and what this says, and then provide sort of my own interpretation of various nuances in this, which I think show various snapshots of where the field's at and the current state of things in sports psychology, particularly regarding performance enhancement this way. So the study starts by basically searching all the major databases where people would publish sports psychology related papers and filters them through what's called a PICO. And PICO is basically a big filter which eliminates various variables we wouldn't want. So for example, if we don't want studies don't include real competitive athletes, they use university students, we can select in the PICO to just filter those out. I'll talk about some of the nuances of this particular PICO they used later, but for now all this literature goes in and it produces 111 studies. Of these 111 studies, unfortunately, only 25 of them can be used in a meta-analysis where they get combined and show us an effect, and that effect shows if they're improving performance or not. Of these 25 studies, there's actually 5 separate meta-analyses which were conducted, And the reason for this was there was basically five specific interventions. Remember, part of the question this was, if psychology interventions work, which ones in particular? So the study basically finds 5 targets, 5 intervention types. And the way I'd think of this is each of these represents a specific psychological target which they think will improve athletes' performance. For example, maybe people think reducing or optimizing anxiety levels is going to improve performance. Or maybe it's something totally different, like just focusing on where someone's attention is. Right? So this is what I mean by specific targets. The first of these targets was what they call multi-modal psychological skills training, and 7 studies went into this. Now, this is, to me, traditional sports psychology. It's the main stuff you read about in Weinberg and Gould's textbook, and includes most of the interventions people are familiar with, like self-talk, arousal regulation, goal setting. These are sort of the standard psychological skills sports psychology is banked on traditionally. And the theory of psychological skills training is to try to optimize psychological states. So, for example, there might be certain amounts of anxiety which are the best for a certain performance. So maybe that's not too much, but a little bit, a certain amount of arousal. And psychological skills training tries to optimize for these levels, the right amount of thoughts, the right levels of anxiety, and so on. So there are 7 of these studies able to be put into a meta-analysis, and it did produce significant results, suggesting they do produce performance benefits. Here, we can see this in the stat right here. We'll go into more detail here in a bit. The next is mindfulness and acceptance approaches, and this is a movement which happened in the early 21st century in sports psychology, and part of it was actually a counter to what researchers thought were theoretical problems with psychological skills training. Anyways, it's become sort of a new paradigm in sports psychology. In the meta-analysis here, there were 6 of these studies which were able to be concluded, and the results that come out are significant effects on performance. You can see this here. Again, we'll go into more detail in a bit. The next target was imagery, and this is where people rehearse various skills in their head before doing it. And the theory here is it activates similar or the same neurons that are used in actually performing the skill. And there are 5 studies using imagery included in the meta-analysis here, and imagery did come out positive. It produced significant performance effects. The 4th target is what they call attentional focus strategy. And this is where you direct your attention either to internal or external things. And it's generally thought when performing a skill, if your attention is focused more on external factors rather than on internal movements or skills, performance will be better. That is with the external focus of attention. The meta-analysis here had 4 of these types of studies, and there were no significant effects found here. The final target was self-regulatory performance instructions, and this is where an athlete frames their performance goals in a way which promotes various aspirations, and this is known as a promotion focus, or focuses more on safety or trying not to lose, and this is called a prevention focus. So these studies would target how an athlete's orienting these performance instructions, and the meta-analysis here had 3 of these types of studies. And again, for this one, there's no performance benefits found. So the basic sort of surface level interpretation of these results is that these 3 targets, particularly psychological skills training, mindfulness and acceptance, and imagery, do seem to show performance benefits in athlete samples. However, I personally think there's quite a bit more nuance which needs to be interpreted here. So the first is that when we look at all 3 of these targets, psychological skills training, imagery, mindfulness, and acceptance, the study composed a more strict statistical standard, and it eliminated all the non-randomized control trials from this group. So in the PICO, the filter we talked about earlier, this did allow group designs which were non-randomized controls into the study. However, it also conducted a more strict analysis which only included the randomized control trials. So in all 3 of these, when you only include randomized control trials, which I think sports psychologists really need to do, it really affects the variables if you don't do this, none of them prove significant. Okay, so this is this pattern we see where the better the study design, the worse the results. And when the study design is poor, it seems to produce better results. However, one thing I notice when I'm looking at the results of the mindfulness and acceptance targets and the imagery targets, when it's only including these randomized control trials, is if we look at the numbers here, we see that there's still a moderate effect size. So there's still a moderate effect from the intervention compared to the people who didn't get the psychological training. And this is almost significant. So it's really a trivial amount here why we can't claim this effect is significant. We see the p-value is at 0.75. Now, to be significant, it would have to be at 0.5. This is related to what's called the confidence intervals. And essentially, 0.075 means there's a 7% chance this effect size was found by chance. And to say a result's significant, you generally need a 5% chance or better for this. So it's very close. It's what we could call a positive trend. And it could just be that there's only so much power in these studies when you eliminate the non-randomized control, where simply the reasons it's not showing significance is because there wasn't a large enough sample. That's a possibility. And we noticed a very similar effect with imagery. However, this particular nuance can't be said for psychological skills training. It showed very little confidence in significant results in the randomized control trials. Now, the second question I'd ask looking at this data is, did this study really evaluate the best we have, the best currently designed studies in sports psychology? And I think there's a few reasons we can conclude that it didn't. So if we go back to the PICO, the filter where all the studies go through, one particular thing they said here is the population had to be adults, and this is generally 18 years old or older. Now, there's one study I can think about. It's the Lundgren study. I've actually made a video on it, where this is an extremely well-designed study for sports psychology standards. It's exactly what we need. However, it used junior hockey players, and this study said it wasn't going to use basically adolescent or junior players. But junior hockey is 16 to 20 years old, so I really think it would fit in. But because the PICO standard is a strict criteria, they had to eliminate that study. So that's just one example of a very well-designed study, which is asking exactly this question we want, which wasn't included. That would go in the mindfulness and acceptance group. And another potential problem here is when all this data was filtered through the PICO, it produced 111 studies. However, only 25 of these were used in these meta-analyses because the other studies were just too different from each other to be included. And therefore, we probably miss a lot of good studies. I know personally the mindfulness and acceptance literature very well. I've read almost all of it. And in my opinion, the studies represented here were not really representative of the best studies which have been done in that field. There's a few which simply weren't included in the meta-analysis because they weren't close enough to other studies. And there's some in psychological skills training which weren't either, such as the Weinberg study from 1994 on goal setting, which is again a really well-designed study. So overall, does this study allow us to make any more real specific claims about sports psychology, about whether it works, whether psychological targets actually do improve athletic performance? I personally don't think it really does. I think there's a lot of good studies which are missed. The results are very vague. They are trending positively in some areas, but don't make significance. I think there's studies which were missed in this, and we still have sort of this vague answer to this question. We can see the authors here say basically exactly this in their discussion. Additional trials with robust research methodology, such as randomized control trials, are required for all types of psychological interventions to further investigate their effect on athlete performance. What I kind of look for here is specific trends where I'd then go evaluate that research a bit more. And like I was saying, I know the mindfulness acceptance literature very well. However, there was a effect here with imagery, which was quite interesting. So what I would do is I would take this and I'd go read those 3 studies which were used in the randomized control trial for imagery and see if there's sort of a positive trend there and something that appears to be leading somewhere. I find in sports psychology it's often the best to read the individual, really well-designed studies because you can get a better idea of what the effect size actually is in a real-world situation. For example, a small effect in the score of a PGA Tour's golf score is actually quite big in the context of that sport, and other times a small effect size might not really be telling you that much. So you have to kind of read the particular study, what sport is it, what's being done. Anyways, thanks for watching.